Shannon Rayanne Turner was a 33-year-old woman from Indianapolis, Indiana. She was a free spirit who would travel wherever her heart took her. On December 4th, 1997, she went to work at Babe's Showgirls, but didn't come home after. She was never seen again. I'm Ed Densel, and this is Unfound. Be careful what you ask for. You just might get it. Who said that first? Some people believe it was a Chinese proverb. I'm not so sure. I tracked it down to Johann Wolfgang von Goethe. To us English speakers, his last name looks like Goethe. What does it mean? It means we rarely take into account what could come along with one of our wishes being granted. Lottery winners are a perfect example. I mean, who doesn't want to win the lottery? But many of those winners end up blowing their entire winnings, all of it, millions of dollars. And in fact, there's a recent story from the United Kingdom about a woman who won the lottery, blew all of her money, and is now suing the Lottery Commission for allowing her to win. That's a true story. The Goethe statement came to mind as I was comparing the disappearance of Shannon Turner, especially what happened a few years after, to the cases we've covered before on Unfound. Because a common statement is, why won't the police do something? It's obvious who made the person disappear. Families ask that a suspect be charged and brought to trial because it all seems so clear. And they get frustrated when the wheels of justice turn so slow. And as you know by now, I feel for every one of these families, and I share those same frustrations. In the case of Shannon Turner, we should think of this episode as a cautionary tale. The Turners got the wish that every family wants, a trial. Even though, for the record, unlike many other families, the Turners weren't asking for it because they personally believed the case was weak and knew the dangers of failure. But now they're the ones who have to live with the prosecution's haste to bring Shannon's disappearance to trial. I guess the wheels of justice can spin too fast as well. And now a summary of the case. This is brought to you by my friend Megan Good's site charleyproject.org. Shannon Turner had made plans to go to Wisconsin, where a family lived, for Thanksgiving 1997. She told them she'd be bringing her boyfriend, David Mays, a man she seemed to be serious about. However, Thanksgiving came and went without Shannon showing up. This was not unlike Shannon, as she had a reputation for being a bit flighty. It also didn't help that at the time, her car was at the mechanic's getting worked on. So Shannon had to rely on others to travel from place to place, or she took public transportation. Around that same time, she called her family in Wisconsin, but made no mention as to why she hadn't shown up for Thanksgiving. Yet, she did say she'd be coming home for Christmas 4 weeks from then. Shannon's family became concerned when Christmas also came and went with no appearance or call from Shannon. It was only then that they determined none of them had heard from her since the month before during that last phone call. Still, the family wasn't worried because Shannon could take off on a moment's notice for Las Vegas, San Antonio, or elsewhere. It wasn't until January 1998 when her landlord called, wanting to know when Shannon was going to come pick up her stuff, thinking she had vacated the premises, that the Turners figured out Shannon was a missing person. An investigation by both the family and the police determined the last time she had danced at Babe's Showgirls was December 4th, 1997. This was backed up by an animal control report showing that on December 6th, a neighbor called to say that Shannon's dog had been left outside for 3 days. Research done by Shannon's family also turned up the fact that her boyfriend, David Mays, was an enforcer for the Outlaws motorcycle gang. The rumor was that Shannon had broken up with Mays shortly before she disappeared. Mays ended up going to jail a few years later with several other outlaws for racketeering, among other charges. The interview is with Shannon's sister, Valerie Turner. Shannon's brother, Greg, also contributed to this episode. Unfound news. Nate Hale from the Conspirators podcast interviewed me a couple days ago. He'll be playing the interview in a couple weeks, so please look for it. Likewise, I'll be playing the interview I did with him around the same time. We did it as a cross-promotion to introduce our respective audiences to different programming, since our shows are in the true crime genre, but not exactly the same. Please check his podcast out on iTunes and give him a nice review. I'm going to start working on a book. Right now it's going to be called The Cases, Volume 1. It'll be all the episodes I did in roughly the first year of this podcast's existence put into written form. So pictures of the victims, maps if relevant, my raw notes from the conversations with guests, transcriptions of every interview, contact information, and my opinions on each disappearance. Yes, it's going to be a huge book. But I think this is where Unfound needs to go. The goal is to solve cases, and that means taking Unfound outside the confines of podcasting. Really, Unfound needs to be everywhere. TV, radio, podcasting, books, etc. And frankly, this will also give Unfound the ability to stay ad-free and Patreon-free. I'll keep you posted as the process continues. And finally, yep, the Unfound Meetup. Nope, still don't have an official name yet. Madeira Beach Library, 6 p.m., May 9th. This is also where Unfound needs to go. Crowdsourcing and networking by regular citizens to solve cases. Where you can find Unfound on Twitter at Unfound Podcast, on Instagram at Unfound Podcast also. The email address unfoundpodcast@gmail.com. On Facebook, the Unfound Podcast discussion group. It's been a real spectacular week there, I just want to say. There you can talk to other listeners, talk to me, and talk to my guests. I also need to give a shout out to listener Ray McFadden, who did some great work right after hearing last week's episode concerning the disappearances of Peggy and Patty McDaniel. You can subscribe to Unfound at Podomatic and iTunes, and thanks to those listeners who gave Unfound some 5-star reviews this past week. Deeply appreciated. And please mention Unfound at the popular places like Websleuths, Reddit, podcasts we listen to, and all other true crime websites and forums. A couple notes about this interview with Valerie Turner. I think it's going to show you that biker gangs are just as bad as they have ever been. They are not something that reached their heyday in the 60s and 70s and they've calmed down since. And in fact, within the last 10 years, there have been some very high-profile shootouts between biker gangs that have gotten innocent people killed. Also, and I didn't even know this when I started looking into the disappearance of Shannon Turner, this particular week in April of 2017 is very important to this case. And I'm going to allow Valerie herself to explain that to you. And in fact, this particular episode is not just about letting you all know about Shannon Turner and what you can do to help the Turners, but it's also kind of a public service announcement. Once you hear what Valerie has to say, you'll know what I mean. I'm so happy to have on this episode of Unfound the sister of Shannon Turner, Valerie Turner. Valerie, welcome to Unfound.
Thank you, Edward.
Valerie, tell the listeners a little bit about your sister Shannon. What do you remember about her? Maybe some images that come to mind when you hear her name.
So Shannon was a really outgoing person. She had an immense amount of friends. She was full of spunk and laughter and lived life to the fullest. She was that way probably all her life. As a child even, she was pretty outgoing and outspoken, and she just had an awful lot of friends. She made friends really easily.
And was she your older sister or younger sister?
She was the middle child of 6. I'm the oldest of 6.
Wow.
And she was third oldest.
Okay, and how many would you say you're 3 years older than her? 4 years or
About 4 years.
4
Yeah, a
years?
little over 4 years.
Okay. And would you say that you two were close, given the age difference?
Um, we were very close. We shared a bedroom growing up as kids. Our family didn't have a whole lot of money, so her and I shared a bedroom. We shared a bed. Um,
Mm.
we lived side by side until I was 15 and had moved away from home. Um, so yeah, we were very close, and I moved away and eventually moved to Milwaukee to go to college, and she would come up and visit, and we spent a lot of time together.
You said that she's a very outspoken, outgoing person, but you and I have talked about that, and I've gotten to know you a little bit. You're a little bit of a different person. Where do you think that kind of personality, uh, she got that from? Was that a heritage trait, or what do you think that was? Why do you think you two were a little bit
Well,
different?
I think part of it, and part of it is that we're the same and that we're very vocal and we say what's on our mind. And I think that came from our mother. But I'm more of a down to earth kind of person. And she used to say that she was leather and I'm lace. Um, I'm more down to earth and plan what I do. And she was more spur of the moment. Let's do it. Let's do it now. Let's go have some fun.
Okay. And being that this is going to be a top of the conversation, I think we should just bring this up down. Do you remember when you found out that she had gotten into dancing?
Um, yeah, she actually started with the exotic dancing pretty early on. She was a very slim um, and large-chested woman, um, and very attractive, and she even wanted to do some kind of modeling, and had talked to some people about that. Um, but it was part of her outgoing personality, I think, that pulled her into that world. She maybe did it a few times and probably made a lot of money at it, and it was easy work for her compared to the cash that she got. And so I think that pulled her in even deeper into that type of business.
But she was also an aunt. You have a couple sons, I believe, 2 sons.
I do. I have twin boys that were
Okay.
born the year before she disappeared, and
Okay.
she adored them. I mean, she was so, so happy to be the aunt of twins. And right after they were born, she came up from Indiana to Milwaukee um, to see the boys in the hospital. She actually showed up at the hospital. They were born 3 months premature
Oh
and
my.
were on oxygen and heart monitors in an NICU unit for 3 months. And she came up to see them in the hospital, and she brought them some little presents, and she was just ecstatic. And then their first Christmas, that um, exactly a year before she disappeared, that first Christmas, she came to visit them, and we actually had video of her holding the babies, and she was excited to be an aunt
Oh
um,
wow.
to my twin boys.
Great. Great. Let's talk about the year 1997. Things that before we get to the disappearance. Of course, you were just a new mother at that time. What else do you remember? Or maybe we can even go back a little further. What do you remember about Shannon's life, maybe that year, the couple years before, and what you knew about it before her disappearance? What do you think about in that
Um,
time?
well, I do remember that um, even in um, going back 10 years before that, she kind of moved around a little bit. Um, she had lived in San Antonio for a while. Um, she had gone back to Indianapolis, and then she moved to Las Vegas for a while, and then she went back to Indianapolis again. So Indianapolis had kind of become her home base. I know that she had an apartment there that she had kind of settled down into, and had been there for a little while.
Mm-hmm.
So she did move around a little bit. She did travel. She would leave Indianapolis for a little while, and with the business that she was in, she could just stop dancing for a while, and she would just go. And then she would come back, and she would resume dancing.
She was just a free spirit. Whatever her inclinations were, she was going to follow them. Kind of.
Wherever the wind blew her,
Yeah,
pretty much.
Right. Okay. And so in 1997, she was in Indianapolis. And and we're just going to talk about him, just his bio right now. When
Right.
did you first hear about the name David Mays?
I believe I never actually heard his name until after she had disappeared. There was a guy, quote unquote, that she had called prior to Thanksgiving of 1997, and had said that she would be coming home, and she was bringing a guy with her. He was supposed to be someone special, that she wanted us to meet, and that she would be bringing him with her. And so that's pretty much all we knew prior to like November of 1997.
Were you surprised by that? Given that she tended to move around, to your knowledge, did she ever talk about a guy like that before? Someone, to quote you, someone special. Did she ever have any other someone specials in her life before this time?
There were guys. There were probably several. There was a guy, I believe, that when she went to San Antonio. There was another guy, I believe, when she went to Las Vegas. And actually, the guy that brought her to Indiana originally had brought her to Las Vegas. And I think that he stayed in Las Vegas and she moved back to Indiana. Either that or she came back with him. Not quite sure about the whole story there. So there were guys that a couple of guys that she had serious relationships with, but nothing. I mean, the guy from Las Vegas and Indiana, that connection there,
yeah,
he was pretty special, but there was never any talk about marriage, not to the family, and there wasn't with this guy either at the time prior to her disappearance.
With David Mays.
We had no idea that she was planning or possibly being engaged to anyone.
Do you remember how you even found out that marriage was the top? Being that you didn't even know his name, was that something you got from another family member or from a friend? How did you get this idea that she and David might be engaged or something like that? Do you remember?
We did not learn that until after her disappearance.
Okay.
It was revealed to us through some interviews that I believe the police had conducted, and my brother had also gone to Indianapolis after she disappeared and spoke with many people associated with the club where she was working. He talked to many of the women there, and they revealed that.
Okay.
So we had no idea.
Okay. Fair enough. Just one more question about this, and then we're going to get into a little bit of the circumstances. Had Shannon ever brought any other men, boyfriends, to Thanksgiving? Had she ever done that before, to your knowledge?
Never.
Never. Okay.
Never.
Let's move into closer to the time that she disappeared now. We need to set this up with this fact, which I think is pertinent to her disappearance. She was having car problems at the time. Her car was in the shop. Do you remember when that started and how long, that had been going on? Because we found out that she had been getting rides to work. You know anything more about that?
Um, we didn't learn until probably into a month after we found out she was missing,
Mm-hmm.
that she had a car that was in a shop. We were contacted by a guy that was a friend of hers, and he said, "Hey, I've got this car. I've got this Shannon's car that's been in my shop. I've been kind of holding it. She wanted me to do some work on it. What do you want me to do with it?" And eventually my brother and my two brothers drove to Indiana and retrieved that vehicle.
So what you're saying is that she had disappeared. You probably you didn't even care at that point where a car was, but you didn't even find out the car was in the shop till like January of '98 or sometime like that.
True. And Shannon, we didn't even know she actually owned a vehicle. She, to my knowledge, had never really owned a vehicle ever that I knew about. She traveled with people. She'd catch buses. She'd take the train. Um, but she had never driven her own car.
Okay, so you weren't even aware at this time, and once again, listeners, remember you were a new mother. You had your own things going in your life. It's not like you knew everything about her life, but
Correct.
you didn't realize that she had a car that was a surprise to you. Okay,
Yeah, we were not aware of that.
okay, so if she was going to be coming for Thanksgiving, she would have been coming in somebody else's car because her car was in the shop.
Yes, I mean, I didn't know whether she was coming in somebody else's vehicle. She could have been taking the bus or the train, but she was bringing somebody else. So I think there was an assumption that she would be traveling with that person.
Okay. Now, what happened at Thanksgiving? She said she was going to show up, but what happened?
She never showed up. She just didn't show up. We all had Thanksgiving and Thanksgiving together, and it wasn't really a huge surprise that she hadn't showed up, and we probably kind of assumed that she didn't have transportation or something else came up. But as I said earlier, she intended to blow with the wind, and sometimes she would say she was coming, and she didn't. But eventually, she would turn up.
And that didn't bother you at all, didn't worry you. You didn't think, well, maybe something happened to her. That was just kind of the way
Not not
Shannon
at
was.
that time. Not
Okay.
at that time at Thanksgiving.
Mm-hmm.
Um, because it had only been a few weeks since she had been spoken to on the phone, um, saying that she was coming. So we weren't at that time worried about her. That she, just because she didn't come didn't mean that there was anything wrong.
Okay.
Because there was, within 2 or 3 weeks of that time period, someone had spoken to her.
And where was Thanksgiving being held that year in 1997?
Um, it was either at my mother's in Wisconsin or in Kenosha, Wisconsin, or my home in Milwaukee, Wisconsin.
Now, there was a phone call, and this phone call is going to play a role later in this interview, that she made to your family's house at some point. We're just not sure all these years later if it was before Thanksgiving or after Thanksgiving, but it's very important to this case. Um, what can you tell the listeners about that phone call? I know, once again, we're a little shady on the details of it, the date, but otherwise, what can you tell the listeners what you know about it?
Sure. So what I remember is that a cousin of mine who had been living at my mother's house, um, no other family members were home that day, and the phone rang, and he spoke to Shannon. And I believe at that point she said that she would be home for Thanksgiving, and that message was relayed to the rest of the family. And that was pretty much all we really knew. She didn't talk to him for more than a minute or two, and that message was relayed. And so that's.
And she called collect too, didn't she? Called collect.
She did. She called collect.
Okay, listeners need to remember that. She didn't say anything about Christmas or anything. First of all, being that your cousin answered the phone, is he or she positive that person on the phone was Shannon?
He was positive.
So we get back to Thanksgiving. Listeners, please remember that phone call. So we have Thanksgiving. She doesn't show up for Thanksgiving. And things just kind of go through December as they were. And everybody's thinking that she was going to come home for Christmas, but she doesn't. What then happens in your family?
Well, there were conversations that we were all a bit surprised that Shannon didn't show up for Christmas, because of all the holidays of the year, she never missed Christmas. The fact that she had 1-year-old nephews that would be celebrating Christmas, she hadn't seen them in probably, I think it was a year. I think it was from the previous Christmas that she had seen her nephews. We had a conversation way prior to Thanksgiving, and I had actually asked her to be godparent to the twins, and we had a conversation about how I needed 2 high chairs for the boys. And she had said, well, let me get those. That'll be my Christmas present to them. And so we were going to go shopping for high chairs when she came home for Christmas. So there was a little bit of conversation that she would be home for Christmas. But that was, a couple of months before.
What you're saying is from Thanksgiving to this time that your family got alarmed when she didn't show up, you really didn't know anything was wrong. You didn't suspect anything. You certainly didn't know that she hadn't been seen in the Indianapolis area since December 4th.
We had no idea at
No
all.
idea.
I mean, there was no way for us to have any inkling that was an issue.
So what did your family do first? Once she didn't come home December 23rd, December 24th, you get Christmas, who did what in your family? Did you start making phone calls? Did somebody drive there? What did you all do?
Well, we did try and call phone numbers we had for her, because of her kind of moving around type lifestyle. And you have to see that this was prior to the big cell phone push. She didn't have a phone all the time. Her phone would get disconnected and she wouldn't have a phone number for a while. So numbers we had didn't work. We weren't able to reach her. And concerns had been growing until I received a call in January.
And tell the listeners about that call.
So her landlord called and asked me if Shannon was coming back to Indianapolis to pick up her things. And at that time, I said to him, what do you mean pick up her things? Isn't she there? And he said he assumed that she was still in Wisconsin from Christmas, and that he had all of her stuff boxed up, and did we want to collect it? At that time, I told him, Shannon never came home for Christmas. She never made it to Wisconsin, and we have not seen her, and we don't know where she is. And that's when I became extremely alarmed. And after hanging up from talking to her landlord, I immediately telephoned the police and started a missing persons case.
And tell the listeners what the police found, what they figured out, and maybe tell the listeners about the dog that Shannon had, and how they narrowed this time frame down to the date all these years later that is it kind of accepted as the day that she was last seen and disappeared. How did that all happen?
Okay, well, I know that they conducted interviews at the place where she worked and tried to speak to as many people there as possible. It was narrowed down to a time frame around December 4th or the evening of December 3rd. She had a dog that when she'd go to work at night, she would tie up out in the backyard. And then when she came home, the dog would obviously come in the house. And sometime between December 3rd and like December 6th, it was probably a few days after she disappeared, so probably around December 6th, neighbors called either animal control or the police and reported this dog having been left out there, no food, no water, and they were concerned. And that's when animal control came out and took the dog. That was more the information that the police had found out, because we weren't aware of any of that at that time. And obviously we're 3 weeks into January, and the dog is, already probably been adopted out. But the police attempted to do some investigating. I think that they were key in finding her vehicle.
That was still like you mentioned before, that had been worked on, that had been fixed, but it still hadn't been picked up.
Been sitting in a garage at this guy's shop. Correct.
Okay.
But I didn't get a whole lot of urgency when I first reported it on that January evening when I called the police, because she was an adult, because there was no indication of foul play as far as her apartment. And then later on, because her landlord had packed up her entire department, there was no real investigation done looking at that apartment.
For forensics or anything else. I mean, that guy, the landlord,
Correct.
man or woman, went in there.
Correct.
Wow.
And he had cleaned out the apartment. He was questioned, and he did say that there didn't seem to be anything out of the ordinary when he packed up. There was no blood. There was no look of the place being trashed or things toppled over, any sign of a struggle or anything like that. So there was no reason to suspect that anything had occurred at that location. But it did, because he had cleaned this place out, he wanted to re-rent the apartment. There was nothing further that he could do and the police could do at that time. But initially they didn't take this very seriously because she was an adult, and because of the quote unquote lifestyle that she was living, the job that she was in.
Right.
It didn't seem to be a major concern to them for a short while, until they started looking into this case.
And the police, did they go to her work and ask questions like, did she show up for work on December 3rd? Did she end up there? How did she end up there? And who drove her to work and who might have picked her up from work? What did they find out?
So I don't really think that they know who drove her to work. She did show up at work either on the 3rd or the 4th, and she did work her shift. No one really seems to know who picked her up that night. A lot of these girls were questioned. At least the girls that were still there. These girls kind of tend to be a little transient, but they spoke to a lot of them. She was friends with a lot of them, and they had reported to the police that Shannon was engaged to this David, that she had 2 days prior, they were supposed to go and get a marriage license, and Shannon called it off, and did not go. She broke it off with him, is what her coworkers, girls that worked at this place, had told her.
Was David Mays seen at the strip club the night that, probably the last night that Shannon worked at the strip club? Was he seen there that night?
Not to the best of my knowledge.
To your knowledge, did the police ever talk to him about the disappearance, at least at that time in late 1997 or early 98? Did the police ever talk to David Mays about the disappearance of Shannon?
They may have attempted to talk to him at that time. I know at later dates they did attempt to talk to him. But I don't know specific incidences shortly after her disappearance where I was told that they spoke with him.
Okay.
I know that the first time they spoke to him, he referred them to his lawyer.
Now, let's talk about that phone call that had been mentioned before. We're not sure if it happened before Thanksgiving, after Thanksgiving. What did you find out about? Was that something that your family found out about, the phone call, or was that something the police found out as to where she had made that call from right around Thanksgiving?
That was something my family found out about afterwards. We, because it was a collect call, it appears on a phone bill, and when we realized that phone bill was important as to where that call came from, that phone bill was dug out. We found that phone bill, and there was a number on it. And so we attempted to call that number. And I don't know at what point we found out, but we eventually found out that phone number belonged to John Walker.
Right, and I want the listeners to remember that name because it's going to come up here very soon.
Sure.
Now, let's get a little bit more into what you ended up finding afterwards. Once Shannon disappeared, months later, what did you find out about David Mays, who he was, and what kind of guy he was? What did you find out?
So through a lot of detective work by my brother, and some information from the police, and I do have to say the information from the police was extremely limited. We learned that David Mays was an outlaw motorcycle biker from this outlaw motorcycle gang. And we learned that he had a role. He had a big role in this gang. He was what the gang considered an enforcer, which means that he carried out, if the gang wanted somebody beat up or they wanted somebody's legs broke, that is my impression of what his job was.
Mm-hmm.
I've never been in a gang, so I don't know how those roles work.
Of
but
course.
We did learn that this gang is not your typical motorcycle club. There are a lot of really great motorcycle clubs out there, but we did learn that this gang is they deal arms, they deal drugs, and they're not really nice guys.
Yeah, what Valerie is saying when she says outlaws, not like small case outlaws. The name of the gang is actually called the Outlaws. In fact, probably more
The
people
outlaws.
are more familiar with like Hell's Angels. This is another version of just another group, another gang called the Outlaws. Uh,
Correct.
did that surprise you? I mean, that really had to worry you when you first found that out, didn't it?
Um, when I found out about the gang,
About
um,
David Mays, about his background.
um, yeah, I mean, with Shannon having been missing, and him a member of that gang, even before we learned details about some of the things that this gang did. Um, I knew the name Outlaws. I knew the name Hells Angels. I knew these were a much different type of biker club than just your traditional biker club.
Sure.
So when I found out that he was associated with this, and then learned, as more and more information came out that he was an enforcer, that did concern me, because this was after my sister disappeared, and someone within the club, and someone who is considered an enforcer of the club could be capable of doing bad things to people.
Sure. Knowing Shannon the way you did, kind of just goes where the wind takes her. Were you surprised that she might have been involved with a guy like that? Because the reputation of these guys in this gang is they're very possessive. The women in the gang are considered possessions and they have to get tattoos and all these things. Did that surprise you that Shannon was involved with a guy like that?
Um, Parts of it surprised me as I learned more and more. And obviously, I did some of my own investigative work to learn what this club was about and what some of the stuff I had heard represented. I wasn't so surprised about the drugs, and that the guy was, kind of a tough guy, because that might have kind of fallen in with her lifestyle. Um, and I did know that she was involved in drugs to some extent throughout the years, and I had no idea how much, but I know that she smoked pot, she drank, she probably did a few other things. What I um, what I didn't know that I learned later was that these guys do consider their women possessions, and you can't just walk away from these guys. They have their women tattooed with a symbol that says property of the outlaws. Um, and Shannon was not one to be anybody's property. She
Yeah.
was very independent, and very strong-willed, um, and a tough girl. She was a tough girl.
Okay, that's the impression that I get from it too. I have to I have to say that the women who, at least my impression, what I think I know about all that kind of culture is that these women tend to be very submissive, and like I said, they're like possessions, and that does not sound like your sister.
Well, learning later, a lot of these girls were addicted to drugs, and so that kind of lessened their inhibition and made them more vulnerable, I think.
That's a good point too, Valerie. That's a very good point. Now, we remember the listeners. I told you to remember the name John Walker regarding that phone call. And in relation to the Outlaws gang, who did you eventually find out John Walker was?
I learned that John Walker was the president of the local club there in Indianapolis.
So when Shannon made that call to your mother's house somewhere around Thanksgiving, at the time she was actually at the president of the Outlaw, the local club anyway, the president's house making that phone call.
That is where that collect call originated from.
Now, listeners are going to be a little surprised about this, but there is a trial involved with this case.
Correct.
What can you tell the listeners about the trial? So we had your sister's disappearance. I guess you could say maybe the trail went cold. The police didn't do probably as much investigation as they could. David Mays lawyered up. Your brother and you and other family members tried to do what you could do, but you can only get so far. But this wasn't the end of David Mays and John Walker and the Outlaws Gang Club. They got involved with a trial. Tell the listeners about this trial.
Sure. Well, there had been a number of arrests, actually, in several different states. To my knowledge, there had been a big sting operation in several states involving different clubs, all biker club, and I'm assuming all outlaws that were arrested all on the same morning. Different sting operations went in and arrested, I believe it was over 20 or 30 guys. It was a big arrest case, and David Mays and John Walker were included in that sting operation. They were both arrested, and I believe they were arraigned and charged under the RICO statute, which, if people do not know, to my knowledge, and I had to learn this as well, to be arrested under the RICO statute, you have to be, or to be convicted under the RICO statute, which was kind of a law that was put into place in the 20s for the mafia. You have to be convicted of, I believe it's 3 crimes that you're charged with, and then it goes with a higher penalty, is the way I understand it.
Mm-hmm.
So they were charged with a number of felonies, and the RICO, and it was to be charged under the RICO statute.
And how soon after Shannon's disappearance were these guys arrested? Do you remember? Was it the next year? Was it 98? Was it 99? Was it 2000? Do you remember?
No, I think it was in 2000, maybe 2001, somewhere around that time period. Maybe even a little later than that. I had actually moved and was living in another area of Wisconsin at the time, and I was actually subpoenaed to appear at that trial.
And so David Mays is on trial. He got indicted. John Walker, leader of the local club in Indianapolis where Shannon made that call, he's indicted. Various other members are indicted. Of course, they have RICO charges against them, but there was another charge brought against at least David Mays. What was that charge?
It was a federal murder charge in the disappearance of Shannon.
So what the listeners you should take from this is that they had this big trial, and at least at that time, the federal government tried to make a case against David Mays and maybe others that Shannon was murdered, even though her body hadn't been discovered. So this was part of this trial, along with all these other charges that had to probably do with gambling and drug use or drug selling and everything else.
Correct.
You did not get to view the trial because you were actually called to testify. Tell the listeners a little bit about that.
Correct. Actually, two of us from my family were subpoenaed to testify when we arrived in, I believe it was Cleveland. I believe it was in Cleveland, Ohio. That's where the trial took place, because some of the criminals I believe, had been from the state of Ohio. So the big Ohio case took place there. My brother and I and my family flew to Ohio, and we met with the federal prosecutors. And at that time, that was the day before the trial was to start. And at that time, they decided that they would be putting me on the stand, and they did not want to put my brother on the stand, but they wanted me to testify.
And what did they want you to, and this was in relation, though, just to be specific, they wanted you to testify regarding the disappearance and probable murder of your sister. They weren't asking you about any of these RICO charges. They were asking you about the murder charge.
Correct. I
Okay.
was there to testify to my last conversations with my sister.
And how did that go?
I was called to the stand. I actually had been wearing a yellow ribbon on my jacket in remembrance of my sister. And before questioning even begun, I was asked by the judge to step out of the courtroom, and I was taken out, escorted by a bailiff. And at that time, I was asked to remove the ribbon from my jacket. I did so. I didn't want to cause any issues with the case or any kind of mistrial or anything like that. So I removed the ribbon. I was escorted back into the courtroom, sat back on the stand. Some questions were asked. Most of the questions pertain to my last conversation with my sister. All of them were objected to, and they were, I believe you call it, sustained. And that was pretty much the end of my testimony.
So the federal prosecutor is there. He asked you something about a question about the conversation. The defense attorney stands up and says, I object. And the judge says sustains, which means you can't answer that question for some reason.
Correct.
For some reason. What was the reason? Do you know why you weren't allowed to answer those questions?
No, I don't. I do recall that the attorney for this group of guys, who were all, by the way, sitting in the courtroom, David Mays, I believe John Walker was there. There were several guys. They were all being tried in the same courtroom together. But the attorney stepped up and asked for a sidebar with the judge at some point, and all of the questions had been sustained, and then I was escorted out of the courtroom.
So you prepared all of that. The federal prosecutor worked with you on the questions and everything, and then when it got to the point where you actually went in there and testified, you didn't even get to say a word.
They really didn't hear nothing. Yeah, basically.
Okay.
I mean, nothing was recorded because it was all, and I think that some of it they took to be hearsay because I was questioned about the conversation with my cousin,
right,
that Shannon had. So some of it I think they might have considered hearsay, and that's why there were objections.
Do you think now, in retrospect, I know it's been several years, do you think that your answers would have been damaging to the defense? Do you think that your questions would have proven anything now that, we're out here in the world where you're not under oath or anything? What do you think now, all these years later?
I don't think that any of my family had any contributing evidence that would have found him guilty. No, I don't think that my testimony would have made any difference.
Okay. When you found out that these guys were going to trial and everything, were you surprised that they were going to try to charge them also with Shannon's murder? Did that surprise you? I mean, what did you think about that?
No, but I was concerned because I know even in today's time period, there have been cases where people have been convicted without a body, but I knew that their case was thin in retrospect to Shannon's disappearance or her murder. I knew they didn't have a whole lot of evidence. And so it was my concern that he be found not guilty. And then I learned later that when he was found not guilty of her murder, that they could not try him again in federal court, which was upsetting.
Yeah, double jeopardies. And yes, you're hearing that right. That David Mays was charged with the murder. And let's just clarify something else. Were they in putting this murder charge in with all of these other RICO charges that had, I don't think, anything to do with murder, but just illegal business of some type? Were they also saying that John Walker and these other guys had something to do with the disappearance, being that they were also sitting in there while you were giving your testimony? I mean, how do you explain that? Did you think that was a little strange or something?
I'm not sure if they it was strange. It was definitely strange for me sitting on the witness stand with all of these other guys, a lot of them who I did not know. The only face I knew was David's, and that came from pictures that were found in her apartment. So it was very strange. But and you asked me before about what I had heard after my testimony was over.
Yeah.
I actually did get to sit in on some of the rest of the trial before I left Cleveland to go back to Wisconsin.
Is this where you want to talk about this woman's testimony? Because we're ready to do that.
It is.
All right, please tell the listeners. This is very interesting. Please do tell the listeners.
So there was a woman who was called to the witness stand who testified that that she was, I believe she was John Walker's girlfriend or wife at the time, and she testified to some interesting things. There was actually a couple of women who testified, but her testimony was extremely interesting in that she testified that around the time period that Shannon disappeared, David Mays had showed up at her house one evening, and he was frazzled beyond anything she had ever seen him at. This is a guy who is an enforcer, and he was upset. He was visually disheveled, and he was upset. She said she testified that that David and John, or actually, I don't think this was John Walker. This was someone else associated with the gang. She testified that him and this man left, and they were gone, she said, somewhere roughly around 6 to 8 hours. And when they returned, they were kind of a mess. And and that David was still very distraught and very upset. And she indicated that she believed that night was the night that Shannon disappeared.
And so what you're saying is that, and to kind of wrap this all together, is that she's at John Walker's house. David shows up frazzled. There's some other guy at the house. David talks to this guy. They leave, and then 6 to 8 hours later, they come back, and it looks they're disheveled. It makes like they've been doing some work or something like that. And to remind the listeners, this is the same house where Shannon made the collect call from somewhere around Thanksgiving.
Actually, I don't believe that this was John Walker's house.
Okay.
I believe that it was another member of David's gang that he was really good friends with, and the woman was this man's wife or girlfriend.
Okay.
I did believe what she said when I heard her testify. There may have been some issues with the court believing some of the things she said. She did appear to me to maybe be coming out of a drug addiction or had lived a really drug addicted life, just from her speech and her manner and the way she looked. She looked like she had lived a very hard life.
Mm-hmm.
But her testimony rang true to me. I believe she was testifying in witness, and she was being put into witness protection.
So what you're saying is this woman testified, and then she got a new name and everything else. That's how valuable they thought.
That is what I believe. At that time, that is what I believed, that she was testifying, and she was in danger for her life.
So that certainly might lend something to the idea that David Mays might have done something to Shannon that night, and this girl was seeing a residual of that, of something that went down.
Sure. And this girl was not only testifying about what she knew around the time period of Shannon's disappearance, but she also had testified about viewing a drug deal, what it sounded like to be a large drug deal, mm-hmm. where her and Shannon were present during this drug deal. And so they both had, evidence, or they both were a danger, if not under control, by these men, by this gang.
We've kind of already foreshadowed where this went, but these guys were found guilty on the RICO charges, but they were found, David Mays in particular, was found not guilty on the murder charge of your sister. Is that correct? That had to hit you hard. That had to hit your family hard.
It did. I can't say that I was surprised. And then at that time, I did learn that there would be no way to charge him in with the federal murder charge. After that, I was angry, mm-hmm. that they had taken this that far without enough evidence to convict him.
Yeah. So if anything, and we're going to get into the coup de grace and all of this in a moment, but what you're saying is if David Mays, who is still alive, is ever going to be charged with anything regarding your sister's disappearance, murder, whatever happened, the state of Indiana is going to have to do that now. It's up to them. It's completely out of the federal courts now forever.
That's correct. And I have had conversations with the detective and detectives because her case has kind of bounced. I think there's now a third or fourth detective that's holding her case. Several of these detectives have either moved on or retired.
Mm-hmm.
But I have spoken to them, and my family has urged them not to bring this case to Indiana court without enough evidence to convict this man.
And so David and these other guys, they went to jail. What year would that have been? Was that about 2002 that they went to jail?
Yeah, approximately. Well,
Approximately.
they were already in jail during the time of the trial.
Mm-hmm.
They were all in jail. They weren't out on their own recognizance.
But they got long sentences, somewhat long sentences. But here is what I was going to mention before. We are doing this interview on April 13th, 2017. Valerie, tell the listeners when David Mays is going to be getting out of jail for this court case way back in 2002.
He's due to get out of prison next week.
Next week.
This coming week.
This coming week. All right. So within the next week, in the trial in which he was charged with Shannon's murder, but it was unsuccessfully prosecuted, but all those other RICO charges, he went to jail, and just very coincidentally, I didn't even know this when I found out about Shannon Turner's disappearance. It's just a coincidence that we were doing this case at the same time that this guy is going to be getting out of jail. And so this show is not just about this disappearance of Shannon. Of course, we want to solve this, but this is also like a public service announcement that very shortly a very dangerous guy is getting back out on the streets within the next week.
Correct.
Wow. Okay. How do you feel about that, Valerie? If you can be honest about this, how do you feel about that?
It's not fair. He had a longer sentence. He had gone to court and they reduced it a little bit. But my sister is never going to get married, have children, live her life. And this man who took her life is going to be walking free with the potential to have a girlfriend, maybe even get married, have children, things like that, or maybe even hurt another woman. That to me is it's just unthinkable.
Yeah. What over the years since it's been all this time, it's going to be 20 years this year. What have you ever heard any rumors? Has any new evidence popped up or anything like that in the last 20 years, or at least since David went to jail in 2001, 2002, whenever it was?
There hasn't been any real substantial anything that's happened during the case.
Mm-hmm.
There is an organization called MJA Inc. who is made up of, from what I understand, some retired police officers and some private investigators type people,
Mm-hmm.
who have made it a point. They're looking for missing persons. They have several missing persons cases from the state of Indiana, my sister's case being one of them, that they would like to solve. They have done some digs where they were given a tip or had a tip that they thought was substantial, not that came to them from the police, but from their own investigative work. And they've dug up some sites, but nothing has ever turned up or been found as a result of their work or the work of the Indianapolis Police Department, which, by the way, has done far less than my brother or this organization, this MJA Inc.
Okay. Of course, the outlaws are very dangerous people. They're just as dangerous now as they were back in the late 90s. And does your family fear that? Given that you believe, your family believes that one of their members, and probably other members at least, know what happened. Do you have any fear in that? Frankly, have you ever been threatened or anything like that over the years regarding trying to figure out what happened to your sister?
I've never been threatened. The fear is always there because I am aware of how dangerous these guys are. But because I've never had any hard evidence, I don't think that they would want to come after me. But David Mays has been incarcerated inside heavy walls for the last 20 years, just about, or 15 years. So he's not been able to come after anyone. And I've not heard anything that he wants to come after. But I mean, that potential is always there because of the type of people these people are.
Yeah. But your experience over the years, you never gone in on his phone calls or, I mean, these days, emails or anything like that, even though these people can be dangerous. I'm just asking. So I'm sure the listeners might wonder about something like that.
Early on, my family actually sent letters to him at the prison where Shannon, we wanted him to remember. We wanted him to be guilty. We wanted him to be haunted by what he's done. And so early on, I sent letters. My brother sent letters. And I'm not sure if other family members had, but I know that I and my brother had. My mother stood up in court the day that the first time we saw David in a courtroom, and she shouted, "David, where's my daughter?" But we have not been threatened. We have not gotten any indication that he is out to get us.
Okay, and for the record, he's never. I mean, back then at the time when the police tried to talk to him before this trial happened, he lawyered up, and he has offered, to your knowledge, has he ever offered any explanation as to what happened to Shannon ever?
Zero.
Zero.
Not a word. Not an expression of concern, considering the fact that he was engaged to her just 2 days before her disappearance. Not any concern that, I mean, he was supposed to marry her, and supposedly when people marry, they love each other. Not a single word of concern, not a single word of knowledge, not a word to my family, not a word to the police.
Not even a story like, well, the last time I saw her, she was getting on a bus headed for Las Vegas. Not even something like that.
Nothing.
Nothing. Okay. Valerie, what do you think went down if we were to accept that David Mays had something to do with her disappearance? What do you think happened?
What do I think happened, or why do I think it happened?
Why it had happened? Yes, why? That's a better way to put it. Why do you think it happened?
Well, let me answer both. To answer the question, what do I think happened? I think David Mays killed her. I think he killed her on that night that he returned to his friend's house, frazzled and discombobulated, and I believe that was the night he murdered her. I believe there are a couple of scenarios, I believe. One, Shannon knew an awful lot about his doings. She'd been in room with drug deals that had taken place. She knew things about him as an enforcer, things he'd done, and she was a risk. She was a loose end. She was dangerous to the entire outlaw. She had been in John Walker's house, so she had to be very privy to a lot of things that were spoken and talked about and done by the leaders of this gang, which made her dangerous to them. So that possibility is foremost in what I think may have happened to her. Her having called it off and seeing she wasn't going to marry this guy, there was a potential that even came, possibly, word came from John Walker that she had to be eliminated because she was too dangerous. That is one of the scenarios. The other possibility is a little simpler in that he was pissed off. I can't have you, nobody's going to have you. And there was a fight, and he killed her. Maybe he showed up at her work that night and said, can we talk? He may have gotten her high before it happened. And maybe he even knew that he was going to do this that night. But for a man not to speak after he supposedly loved a woman, not to talk to anyone afterward, speaks volumes about guilt, in my opinion.
What did this do to your family? What has this done?
I'd have to say that my family is probably more distant than we had ever been. We were a pretty tight family. Christmases were held at either my house or my mom's house, Thanksgiving, holidays, and that didn't happen after that. My mom has been through various illnesses, and some of it doctors thought were psychosomatic, of all the depression that she's gone through and had to deal with. My stepdad, who had been my father since I was like 3 years old, and Shannon was a newborn baby when he came into my mother's life. She was his baby. He died not knowing. He died not knowing what happened to Shannon. He died not knowing what happened to his little girl. There was the trial in Ohio, put a rift between me and my brother because they didn't put my brother on the witness stand, and they put me, and he felt like he should have testified, and that created some difficulties between him and I. And it's put a seam right down the middle of my family. Maybe in some ways that crazy, funny, hilarious girl was the glue that held this entire family together. And when she disappeared, our hearts broke, and we just got pulled apart by all the grief, by all the things that just created separation.
Yeah.
And I know that my mom was never the same after I've never lost a child. I only have two. My mother has lost two. Several years after Shannon disappeared, that week in December, my stepfather passed away of cancer, and I also lost a brother in that same year. In that same week, my father died. My brother was shot and killed, and that added to a huge amount of grief for my mother, and it just compounded the grief she already had, and now she's lost two children. I can imagine losing one, but to lose two has to be devastating for a parent.
Right. Do you hope that now that David Mays is getting back out of jail here shortly, you're hoping to put some new focus on this now that he's out of jail and he's going to be walking around? I mean, it's easier to see him and to see what he's doing and everything else. Are you hoping that his release from prison can add some new light? Of course, Unfound will be doing that, but other people may be looking at this case again now that he's out.
I mean, it's always my hope. It's always my hope that David goes out some night and gets drunk in a bar and shoots his mouth off, says something he shouldn't, or at the very least, he gets himself into trouble and gets locked back up again where he belongs, so that that danger is taken off the streets. But it's always the hope that we learned some information that would at least recover my sister's remains so that we can bury her.
Valerie, do you have a Facebook site or anything like that where my listeners can maybe get to know you, communicate with you? Because that's a huge part of what Unfound does, is that I provide a venue, as you probably know about, on Facebook that's private, where the guests can talk to the listeners about the case and maybe they can help in some way. Do you have a Facebook page for your sister? Where can people find out more about her disappearance?
I don't have a Facebook page dedicated to her, just because Facebook came after Shannon's disappearance, and I never really thought that media could help in the way that we wanted it to help. But there are numerous missing sites where her picture and her information and her description, because she had several tattoos, and her story, at least from a police detailed description, are on, and all you have to do is go to the missing or the lost, and Google that, and it will come up, and if you put in her name, you'll be able to find that information.
Okay, and what I'm going to do when this episode gets posted, I'm going to post those links, I guess maybe to Websleuths and NAMUS and my friend Megan Good's site, charleyproject.org, and all those places. And I will, and I'll help, of course, do that for you. No problem.
Wonderful.
Valerie, anything else before we end the interview?
No, I think that's pretty much her story.
Okay. Valerie, I deeply appreciate you joining me and the listeners on this episode of Unfound.
And I can't express to you my thanks enough for what you're doing to call attention to our missing family members, because you're a voice that not a lot of people and not a lot of other people are voicing, and you're a voice for our families when we can't get the police to do those type of things, or we can't get the media after 20 years to be interested. You're a voice for our families.
I'm overwhelmed by that. I can't. You're too kind, Valerie. I deeply appreciate that. Thank you very much. Thank you.
Thank you.
And thank you for being on this episode of Unfound.
And that was my interview with Valerie Turner, sister of Shannon Turner. I thank Valerie for telling her sister's story. I also need to thank Darlene Pitts, a former guest, sister of missing person Kathy Fry, for putting me in touch with Valerie. I'm recording this part of the episode a few days after I interviewed Valerie, and those words that she said to me at the end of the interview still continue to resonate. I cannot even begin to tell you how much that means to me, and I'll continue to just do the best job that I can. I also need to mention Greg Turner, brother of Shannon and Valerie, who also contributed to that interview. Well, he also made some points to me on his own. He and I had a couple telephone conversations, and I found out something that backs up one of his claims, and I think all of you are going to find it very interesting regarding Shannon, regarding Babe's Showgirls, the place she was dancing that night, and the Indianapolis Police Department. First, though, I want to go over some main points from the interview with Valerie. The most important point from that interview? Yes, you heard it right. David Mays is a free man now. And by the time you are hearing this episode, he is walking around like any other free person out there. And this episode first aired on Podomatic and iTunes on April 21st, 2017. And as I think about him being in jail all that time, I have my own opinion on that. And I expressed this to Valerie in one of the conversations we had before the interview. I actually think him being in jail this whole time hurt the cause of finding Shannon Turner. Yes, I know it was probably good for society that David Mays and all of those other guys were locked up. But for the Turners themselves, it wasn't so good. Because while Mays is in jail, he can't really get in any trouble. There's no way to threaten him. He's already in jail. There's no way to entice Mays to talk. And maybe something would have happened, not necessarily with him, but maybe something else that went on with the Outlaws in the last 12 to 15 years that would have caused him to talk to authorities about what happened to Shannon. As long as he was in jail, he had no reason to talk, and they surely weren't going to let him out early for revealing what he did to Shannon, and that's, of course, what we think happened. So him being in jail all this time, I think, set back the investigation into Shannon's disappearance. Also, and this is the reason this episode is called A Cautionary Tale, and I mentioned this before the interview, we all hate that the wheels of justice turn so slowly, if at all. But we now see the fallout from going too fast. A not guilty verdict, and all these years of the Turners having to live with the result. And the jury found Mays not guilty despite the testimony of the woman Valerie mentioned and others who backed up this woman's story. Luckily for the Turners, the city of Indianapolis or the state of Indiana can still do something. They have, I guess, what you might call a backup plan. But for all of these other cases that we've covered on Unfound, it's hard to imagine that if the state were to mess up in one of these prosecutions, that the federal government would actually step in. And in fact, all these other cases, I think you could say there's no backup. The prosecutors will have to get it right the first time, unlike in this case where the federal government, of course, got it wrong, but there's still hope someday that the state of Indiana will do something. We just need to keep this all in mind as we cover more cases on Unfound where there are obvious suspects, a lot of evidence, but the prosecutors don't want to do anything. As for my conversations with Greg Turner, he gave me some excellent additional information. However, some of it was told to me in confidence, and some of it I still have yet to verify. Just could not get to it before I needed to publish this episode. But I can tell you this, some of it has to do with comments by outlaw gang members since Shannon disappeared. Them saying in so many words that they believe that David Mays and others had something to do with Shannon's disappearance. Greg gave me those names, but I'm going to keep them out of this episode for now. What has borne some fruit, and certainly backs up one of his claims, and I need to preface this by all of you having to understand that we all know that there are crooked cops out there. And there are cops who are on the take from gang members. I, of course, think of the TV show The Shield that was popular on FX back in the early 2000s. That show is actually based on a true story of what was going on at a precinct in Los Angeles during the 1980s, 1990s. There are cops who are on the payroll of gangs. And that was a conversation that Greg and I had. Well, to back that claim up, I found a story from the Indianapolis Star. The story was published about 6 months after Shannon disappeared in June of 1998. I'm going to read the story to you. An Indianapolis woman has sued an Indianapolis Police Department officer accusing him of harassing and intimidating her as he tried to collect a debt on behalf of a topless club. The dispute began with a broken window and escalated into 2 lawsuits in a Marion Superior Court. Deborah Sanders says Sergeant Dennis Riley threatened her 2 times while in uniform last fall after her son was arrested for breaking a window at Babe's Showgirls, 7259 Pendleton Pike. You'll remember that Babe's Showgirls is the last place that Shannon danced. Riley, 39 years old, a security guard for the club, came to Sanders' East Side apartment to collect reimbursement for the broken window, she states in her lawsuit. She alleges he violated the Fair Debt Collection Practices Act. The Indianapolis Police Department suspended Riley in March for an unrelated incident. IPD Chief Michael Zunk has taken steps to fire Riley. Through an IPD spokesman Thursday, Riley denied the harassment and said he was off duty when he did business for the topless club. The lawsuit, filed Wednesday in Marion Superior Court, also names the nightclub's owner, JABA, J-A-B-A, Incorporated, and the city of Indianapolis as defendants. Several other officers were also sued. Now, I don't want to go too deep into the details of that story. All of you are surely smart enough to see the point I'm trying to make with that story. But what catches my eye is the end of the article. Several other officers were also sued. Well, the only reason that several other officers would be sued is if several other officers were also security guards at Babe's Showgirls during their off-duty hours. So we have a bunch of cops who are working security at a strip club. We have a woman, a dancer there, disappear after working at that strip club. But I'm here to tell you, I mentioned this story to Valerie once I discovered it. I asked her, did you know that there were off-duty cops who were working security at Babe's Showgirls back at the time that Shannon danced there? Her answer was a simple no. So not only in all of the research that she has done and her brother has done regarding all of this, have they not discovered that, but it doesn't seem like the Indianapolis Police Department ever let them know that either, which seems kind of suspicious. And this goes back to, I think, what Greg was saying, and I agree with him, that there's a belief out there that the Outlaws had some Indianapolis cops on the payroll. This kind of story would certainly support that idea. So I want you to all think about that, and you can do your own research on it. You can find it if you do a search. The other point I want to make is something also that Greg told me, and I looked into this as well, and this had to do with the murder of Brian Donahue in March of 1998, 3 or 4 months after Shannon disappeared. He had an affiliation with the Outlaws gang. I don't know if he was an actual member, but he dealt drugs with them. He had some sort of arrangement with them, some sort of relationship with them. He was found murdered in his apartment, like I said, in early 1998. That is a murder that is still unsolved. This was a murder that Greg told me about to look into. A few years ago, I don't know if it was the city of Indianapolis or the state of Indiana, they put together a deck of cards with unsolved murders on them and handed these deck of cards out to the prison population in the hopes that the inmates seeing these pictures on the cards, one of them might come forward and say, I know something. I went through that entire deck of cards. I found the entire deck online, and it was published several years ago, but the pictures are still online. Brian Donahue's murder is the only one in that deck of cards that can be tangentially connected to the Outlaws biker gang. And these are murders that cover 3 decades or something like that. At least 3 decades. The coincidental part to me is that this murder just happened to occur around the same time that Shannon disappeared. And so I can't help but start thinking, was the murder of Brian Donahue connected to the disappearance of Shannon Turner? You can't help but think about that and wonder about that. And I wonder if Indianapolis police, at least the good cops, could start looking into this murder of Brian Donahue, that they might also get some leads on the disappearance of Shannon Turner. And one last point. Now that David Mays is out of jail, I'm hoping that the Indiana media, the Indianapolis media, starts to take a new, fresh look at what happened in the disappearance of Shannon Turner and see if this murder of Brian Donahue, for example, can be connected to it. I think we here at Unfound are trying to start that. I'm hoping that the local media there will continue it. And that's the program. I'll leave the rest of the theorizing up to you. And that's the program. If you found it informative, please go to the app that you use to listen to Unfound and give this podcast a nice review. I thank you for listening. I'm Ed Densel, and you've been listening to Unfound.